On the third morning, Captain Sarn screamed himself hoarse at a man who would not so much as blink, and I stood 8 feet away pretending my legs were not shaking. I had been of the household guard for exactly 19 days. I knew how to hold a rifle at the slope, how to march the long gallery without letting my heels clatter, how to keep my chin level while 100 visitors filed past, and one of them always made a face to see if I would smile. What no one had taught me was what to do when a captain of the guard planted himself in front of a sergeant of the guard and ordered him, by all the authority of the crown, to step aside, and the sergeant simply did not. The door behind the sergeant was called the rose door. Its 2 tall leaves were carved over every inch with roses, climbing and opening and folding shut again, the wood worn pale at the height where a hand would push. Beyond it lay the innermost apartments of the palace of Harrogate, rooms that had been Queen Isolde's while she lived, and that now, 3 days into a sickness no one would name aloud, held King Alaric where he had fallen. The sergeant's name was Corwin Hale. He was perhaps 60, though the bearskin and the tunic made a man ageless, and he stood before the rose door with his rifle grounded and both gloved hands folded on the muzzle cap, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Captain Sarn's head, as if the captain were weather and would pass. Sergeant Hale. Sarn had a good voice for a parade ground and no gift at all for a corridor where it came back off the marble and struck him twice. You are ordered to your quarters. You are relieved. Corporal Brant will take the post. Ground your charge and stand down. Hale did not stand down. He did not answer. He breathed, and the brass buttons of his tunic caught the gray windowlight and let it go, and that was the whole of his reply. Do you hear me, man? He heard him. I would have staked my 19 days on it. There was a listening in Hale that had nothing lax about it, the listening of a hound that has been told one word and is waiting through all the others for it to come again. He heard Sarn perfectly. He had decided that Sarn was not the thing he was listening for. I did not understand it then. I want that on the record before I tell the rest, because a great many people who were nowhere near that corridor have since explained to me, at length, what they would have grasped at once. They would have grasped nothing. On the third morning there was nothing to grasp. There was only a sergeant who would not move, a captain going purple, and a kingdom quietly coming apart 3 floors above our heads, while the man at its center lay behind a door of carved roses and could not tell us what he wished. Let me set it out as it stood, so you feel the shape of it the way we felt it. 3 days before, in the middle of a council on the spring levies, King Alaric had risen to make a point, pressed one hand flat to the table, and gone down as though the floor had been pulled. The physicians had him in the rose apartments before the hour was out. By nightfall the word that ran the servants' stairs was the word that always runs them, that he was dying, that he was already dead, that he had spoken, that he had not spoken since. Only one of those was true, and none of us below stairs knew which. Crown Prince Rowan, who should by every custom have been at his father's side within the day, was at sea. He had sailed a fortnight earlier to open the new harbor works at the far end of the realm, a journey of good weather and goodwill that had turned, with one collapse, into the worst-timed absence in the history of the house. A fast cutter had gone out after him. Wind and water would decide when he came, and wind and water are no respecters of a crown. That left the palace for 3 days in the hands of the one person eager to hold them, the queen consort Morwenna. I will try to be fair to her, because it is easy now to be otherwise, and because a witness who hates loses the trust of anyone listening. She was the king's second wife, married these 6 years, and she was not the mother of the heir. Rowan was Isolde's son, grown and formed before Morwenna ever came to Harrogate, and there was no love lost across that gap and never had been. In the 3 days since the king fell she had been, by turns, grief-struck and practical and gracious and cold, and a person who had never met her might have watched her cross the state rooms with her ladies and thought, "There is a woman bearing a great weight well." A person who watched the corridors, as guards watch corridors, saw something else. She wanted the rose door open. She wanted it open more than she wanted air, and a sergeant she had likely never troubled to name was the reason it stayed shut. "Corporal Brant," said Sarn, not looking away from Hale, "take the post." Brant was a decent man and no fool. He came forward 2 steps, stopped, and looked at the space Hale filled the way you look at a doorway you have been told to walk through when someone very large is standing in it. Hale's eyes came down at last, down off the middle distance and onto Brant, and there was nothing hostile in them, nothing wild, only a kind of grave apology. He gave, very slightly, the smallest shake of his head I have ever seen a man give. And Brant, who outranked me and knew a great deal more than I did, stepped back. "He won't, sir," Brant said quietly. "He will, or he'll answer for it." "Sir," Brant's jaw worked. "He's not drunk and he's not mad. I've soldiered beside him. Whatever this is, it's not what it looks like." "It looks like mutiny," said Sarn. The word landed in the corridor and sat there. Mutiny. It is not a word you say lightly of a household sergeant with 30 years on his record and the cross of the realm in a case somewhere among his kit. It is a word that, once said, wants a court and a verdict to close it. Sarn had said it in front of 4 guardsmen and 2 footmen, and I watched him understand, a half-second late, that he could not now unsay it. Hale looked at him, and then Hale did the only thing I saw him do all that long day that could be called speaking. He shifted his grounded rifle a half-inch. A small, deliberate correction, the movement of a man settling deeper into a stance he did not intend to leave, and he returned his eyes to the point above the captain's head. It was not defiance. I have thought about this more than about almost anything else in my life, and I am sure of it. Defiance leans forward. Defiance wants you to see it. What Hale did was the opposite. He made himself heavier and quieter and more finished, the way a stone in a river does not defy the water. He was not refusing Sarn. He was keeping something, and Sarn was simply not the man who could ask him to stop. Sarn turned on his heel and went to fetch a heavier authority, and the corridor let out a breath it had been holding. I was posted that day at the head of the short stair that led onto the rose corridor, a nothing post, a boy's post, meant to salute the great and turn away the curious. From it I could see the length of the passage, the tall windows on the courtyard side, the rose door at the far end, and Hale before it, small with distance, and yet the plainest thing in view. Through the morning the traffic of the palace found reasons to pass. Under stewards with trays that no one had ordered, a clerk with a portfolio. 2 of the queen consort's ladies, arm in arm, slowing as they came level with the sergeant and studying him as though he were a picture that had been hung crooked. He did not look at them. He looked at nothing, and by looking at nothing so completely, he made everyone who passed feel looked at. Toward noon the old guard armorer, a man named Dunmore who had been mending the house's rifles since before I was born, came and stood beside me on the stair with the excuse of the weather. "You'll be the new lad," he said, "Frey." "Yes." "Watching the sergeant." "Everyone's watching the sergeant." Dunmore had a way of talking without moving his mouth much, a skill you learn in a place where the walls carry sound. And not one of them can tell you why he does it, because there's not one of them he'd tell. He was quiet a moment. "I've known Corwin Hale 40 years, since before the king was the king. There's a thing about him you should understand, and then you should hold your tongue about it, because it's not mine to give away and it's certainly not yours." He nodded down the corridor at the still red figure. "That man does not break his word, not to save his skin, not to please a captain, not for the whole treasury under this floor. If Corwin Hale is standing at a door and will not move, then somebody he answers to told him to stand at that door and not move, and no captain in this house outranks that somebody, whoever they are." "The king," I said before I could stop myself. Dunmore looked at me sidelong. "Did I say that?" "No." "Then neither did you." He straightened the visit over. "Watch and learn, Frey, but mind, watching's the easy part. You'll be asked, before this is done, to do more than watch. And when you are, You remember that the loudest man in the corridor is almost never the one who's right. He went. I did not know then how soon I would need those words, or how much they would cost to keep. The heavier authority Sarn fetched arrived in the middle of the afternoon, and it was heavier than any of us expected. It was the Lord Chamberlain himself, Osric Penhallow, in his chain of office, with 2 clerks and a document. The Chamberlain is not a soldier. He is the household made flesh, the keeper of who may go where and when, and there are men who have served the crown their whole lives and never once been addressed by him directly. He came down the rose corridor at the pace of a man who has decided a thing, is beneath him, and means to be finished with it quickly. Sergeant, Penhallow did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. I am told you have refused to be relieved. I am told you have refused a captain. I will tell you now once plainly what you perhaps have not understood. The king is gravely ill. The ordering of his household falls in his incapacity to the queen consort. Her Majesty desires access to the king's apartments to sit with her husband, as is her right and her wish. You are standing in the way of a wife at her husband's sickbed. Do you grasp how that will sound, Sergeant, when it is told? Now ground your charge and let her pass. It was well done. I will grant it was well done. He had turned the whole thing, in 4 sentences, from a question of duty into a question of decency, and he had done it in front of witnesses, so that Hale's silence would look not like discipline but like cruelty. And Hale, for the first time, moved his mouth. I was too far to hear, but Brant was near, and Brant told me after, and I believe him, because it fit the man. Hale said, I would carry Her Majesty to any door in this house on my own back, not this one, not yet. Not yet, Penhallow repeated, and when, Sergeant, when is yet? And Hale said nothing more, because that, the when, was the very thing he was keeping, and he would no more spend it on the Lord Chamberlain than a sentry fires his last round to answer a question. Penhallow studied him. He was a clever man, and I think in that moment some cleverer part of him understood that he was not looking at a broken soldier but at a locked one, and that the key was not in this corridor. But cleverness serves whoever pays it. He inclined his head a precise inch, turned, and said to his clerk, loud enough to carry, Note that the sergeant was offered every courtesy and refused it. Note the hour. Then he too went away up the corridor, and the making of a case against Corwin Hale, which had begun as a captain's temper, took on the weight of the household's own record. I remember thinking, as the long light came slantwise through the courtyard windows and reddened the marble, that it could not go on. A man cannot stand at a door forever. He must sleep, must eat, must yield to the plain arithmetic of the body. Whatever he was keeping, the hours would spend it for him. I was 19, and I did not yet know what a man can do when he has decided that the door behind him is worth more than the body in front of it. It was full dark, the courtyard lamps lit and the corridor gone to shadow between the windows, when the thing happened that made me understand this was not a matter of one stubborn sergeant, and that the whole weight of the house was going to come down on that door, and soon. The queen consort came herself. She came without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony, no ladies, no chamberlain, only 2 of the tall private guards who answered to her household and not to the guard proper, and a single sheet of paper in her hand. She was in gray, the color a wife wears when she wishes the world to remember she is grieving, and she was, I will say it plainly, magnificent to look at, the way a drawn sword is magnificent. She came down the rose corridor and she stopped before Sergeant Hale, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the whole passage seemed to lean in. Sergeant Hale, she said, her voice was low and carried perfectly, I have not come to argue with you. I have come to show you something, and then I believe you will let me pass, because you are a man of duty, and I hold in my hand the thing that duty answers to. She lifted the paper. Even from the stair I could see the dark blot at its foot, a seal, red wax, and pressed into it the unmistakable device of the king, the rose and the sword of the house of Harrogate, the mark that opens every door in the realm. This is the king's own order, she said, under his seal. It commands that I be admitted to him. You know this seal, Sergeant. You have obeyed it your whole life. Every door in this house, every gate, every guard bows to it. Look at it, read it, and stand aside. I held my breath. I think the whole corridor held its breath. Here at last was the one authority that no soldier of the house could refuse, the king's own hand and seal, the fixed star the entire guard was built to serve. Whatever private order Hale believed himself to be keeping, it could not stand against this. Nothing could. That was the whole point of a king. Sergeant Hale looked at the paper. He looked at the seal, the true seal, the rose and the sword in red wax an arm's length from his face. And he did not move. He did not read the paper. That was the strangeness of it, the thing that made the two private guards behind Morwenna shift their weight and glance at one another. A man refusing an order argues with it. He takes it. He reads it. He finds a fault in it. Hale did not so much as let his eyes settle on the words. He looked at the seal. I am certain he looked at the seal, the real seal, the mark that had ruled his whole life, and something crossed his face that was not doubt and was not fear. It was grief, as if the seal being real made the thing before him worse, not better. You have seen it, Morwenna said. There was the first hairline crack in the low, carrying voice, not loud but present, the sound of a person who had prepared for every answer except no answer at all. It is his seal. You know it is his seal. Hale's lips moved. Brant again was near enough. What he said was, "It is his seal, madam, it is not his voice." He cannot give you his voice, Sergeant. He is beyond speaking. That is why there is a seal. Then I am sorry, said Hale, and closed his mouth, and that was all. I did not understand it. I want to be honest about the whole progression of my own understanding, because the understanding is the story. In that moment I thought, God forgive me, that Dunmore had been wrong, that the old armorer's faith in his friend had blinded him, and that I was watching a good man's mind give way under grief and exhaustion, refusing even his king's seal because some cracked corner of him could not accept that the king was dying. I thought Hale had gone somewhere the rest of us could not follow, and that it would end badly. I was wrong twice over. He had not gone anywhere. And he had understood, before any of us, the one thing that mattered, that a seal is only wax, and wax can be pressed by any hand that holds the matrix, and the king had known that, and had built against exactly this hour. But I get ahead of myself. Morwenna stood before the rose door a long moment. Then she did something I have turned over many times. She did not rage. She lowered the paper, and she looked at Sergeant Hale, really looked at him. The way you look at an obstacle you have just realized is not going to be moved by anything you brought, and she said, quite softly, so that only the nearest of us caught it, "Whose man are you?" And Hale answered her, softly too, and this I heard myself, because the corridor was that still. "The king's, madam. Only ever the king's. The king is dying." "Then I will be the king's until he is dead," said Hale, "and past that if he asks it of me." She turned and left. She did not hurry, but I saw, as she passed beneath the courtyard lamps, that her hand had closed on the sealed paper hard enough to crush it, and I understood that a line had been drawn that night that only one of them would walk back across. That was the end of the third day. The fourth day they came for him with law. I have learned since how quickly a thing can be dressed in the clothes of order. By the middle of the morning there was a paper posted in the guard hall, a proper paper, signed by the Lord Chamberlain and countersigned by 2 of the household's magistrates, declaring that Sergeant Corwin Hale stood accused of refusing lawful command, of obstruction of the household in a time of the king's incapacity, and of conduct tending to mutiny, that a court of inquiry would sit within 3 days, and that, pending it, the sergeant was suspended of his rank and was to be removed from his post and confined. Removed from his post. 2 clerks and a captain's temper had become, in a single day and night, the machinery of the whole house turning against one man at one door. And the machinery had a logic that was very hard to stand against, because every wheel of it looked reasonable on its own. Of course, a sergeant who refuses command must answer for it. Of course, a wife must be allowed to her husband. Of course. It is always of course. That is how a wrong thing walks into a great house, not roaring but reasonable, one of course at a time. They could not simply drag him, though. That was the thing that held them, the fourth day and the fifth. To lay hands on a sergeant of the household guard in the corridor of the king's own apartments before witnesses and haul him away by force, that is an ugly picture, and Morwenna, whatever else she was, understood pictures. If she was to be seen to have Hale torn from the king's door, it must be lawful past all questioning, and it must be done by the guard's own hand, not by her private men. A house does not forgive an outsider who spills a soldier's dignity in its halls, but if the guard itself, through its own commander, ordered the thing and carried it out, then it was discipline, and no one could say otherwise. Which is how the whole weight of it came on the fifth day to rest on the shoulders of one man who had been, until then, absent from the corridor entirely, the commander of the household guard, Torvald Rain. I had seen the commander perhaps twice in my 19, now 24 days of service, always at a distance, always in motion. He was a spare, iron-gray man of 50-odd, not tall, with a still face and a way of entering a room that made the men in it stand straighter before they had consciously seen him. The guard loved him, in the wary way soldiers love a commander who is fair and cannot be fooled. He had been away in the north when the king fell, inspecting the border companies, and the fast riders had brought him back only on the evening of the fourth day, into a house that had spent his absence tying a knot he was now expected to cut. He came to the Rose corridor on the morning of the fifth day, and I was there, because by then I had contrived to be there, swapping my nothing posts, trading duties, doing whatever a boy can do to keep himself near the thing that mattered. Dunmore had said I would be asked to do more than watch, and I did not yet know what, but I knew I wanted to be in the corridor when it came, and not hear of it after on the servants' stair. Rain walked the length of the passage alone. Behind him, at the head of the stair, a knot of officers gathered and did not follow Sarn among them, and Penhallow's clerks, and two of the magistrates, and, standing a little apart in grey, the queen consort. They had all come to watch the commander do the thing they had built for him to do. The whole corridor understood the shape of the morning. Rain would order Hale to stand down, one soldier to another, commander to sergeant, the last and highest authority the guard possessed. And when Hale refused even that, there would be nothing left to call it but mutiny, plainly and finally, and the men waiting at the stair would come down and take him, and it would all be lawful, and the Rose door would open. Rain stopped before Sergeant Hale. For a long moment the two men simply looked at one another, and it was not like Sarn's looking or Penhallow's looking. There was history in it. I did not know its shape, but I could see its weight, two old soldiers who had stood in more corridors than I had years, taking each other's measure across a thing that was about to break one of them. "Corwin," said the commander, "not Sergeant Corwin." And the whole corridor heard the softness of it, and understood that Rain had chosen, deliberately, to come to him first as a man and not as a rank. Hale's eyes closed for the briefest instant. It was the only time in 5 days I saw the cost of it cross his face, the naked, exhausted cost, and it was Rain's voice that drew it, where a captain's fury and a chamberlain's contempt and a queen's low steel had all failed. Then his eyes opened and were steady again. "Commander, they tell me you have refused the captain, the chamberlain, and the queen consort's own hand under the king's seal. They tell me you will not be relieved and will not eat and have not slept. They tell me you will answer no one." Rain's voice was very level. "Is it true?" "It is true, Commander." "Will you tell me why?" And here is the thing I have never forgotten, the hinge of the whole matter, though I did not know it was the hinge. Hale looked at Rain, and I saw him want to. I saw the want in him, the pure animal want of a man 5 days alone inside a thing too heavy to carry, to set it down for one moment into the hands of the one man in the house he trusted. He wanted to tell Rain everything, and he did not. "No, Commander," he said, "I cannot. Cannot or will not. For me they are the same word." Rain was silent. Behind us at the stair, someone shifted impatiently, and I hated them for it. Then the commander said, low, so that it did not carry beyond the two of them and the boy pretending to guard the near window. "Corwin, I know you. I have known you since the Asheville campaign, and I have never in 30 years seen you break faith with anything. So I will ask you not as your commander, but as the man who watched you carry Halloran off the field with a ball in your own leg and never once put him down. Whatever this is it worth your name? Because that is what it will cost you now. Not your post, your name. They will write you down a mutineer, and I do not know that I can stop them." Hale's jaw worked. When he answered, his voice had gone rough. "My name is a small thing to set against what's behind this door, Commander. If keeping it means letting them past me, they can have my name. Burn it in the hall. I'll stand here without it." That is not an answer. It is the only one I have to give a man who cannot say the words. Rain went very still. I did not understand the phrase then, the words, said as though it were a thing with edges, a specific thing, a named thing. But I saw it land on the commander, saw some old memory move behind his iron face and then be pushed down, because there was no time for it and the corridor was full of watchers. "What words, Corwin?" he said quietly. And Sergeant Hale, for the 6th time in 5 days, closed his mouth on the very heart of the matter, and said nothing at all. Rain stood before him a moment more. Then he straightened, and his voice changed, went flat and formal and pitched to carry, because now he was speaking for the record, for the watchers at the stair, for the case that was being built. And I heard under the flatness that it cost him. "Sergeant Corwin Hale, as commander of the household guard, I order you to ground your charge, quit this post, and submit yourself to the court of inquiry. Do you obey?" The corridor held its breath. "No, Commander," said Hale, "I do not." There it was, said plainly to the highest soldier in the house before every witness that mattered. The last door was shut. Behind me at the stair I heard the intake of breath, the small satisfied stir of people who have watched a trap close exactly as they said it. Mutiny, plain and proven. Nothing left now but the taking of him. But Rain did not signal the men at the stair. He stood looking at Corwin Hale for a long, long moment, and then he did a thing that none of the watchers expected, a thing that bought Hale his life and the kingdom its rescue, though it looked at the time like nothing but a delay. He turned to the stair and said, "The court will sit. Until it does, this post is under my hand, and no one lays a finger on this sergeant without my order. Anyone who touches him before the court has ruled answers to me for it." He let that sit. "Including Her Majesty's men. This is a guard matter now. It will be settled by the guard." It was a small thing. It was everything. He had not saved Hale. He had only taken the taking of him out of Morwenna's hands and into his own, and bought 3 days by doing it. But 3 days, it would turn out, was exactly the length of the fuse that had been lit 5 days before behind the rose door. In a sick room no one but the king's own physician had been able to enter, because a sergeant would not let them. That evening Dunmore found me on the servants' stair, where I had gone to be alone with a knot in my chest I could not loosen, and he sat down beside me with the slow care of an old man and a stone jug, and he told me the part of it that was his to tell. "You want to understand him," he said. "It was not a question. Everyone does now. Too late, but they do." He drank and passed me the jug, and I held it and did not drink. "I'll tell you a thing, and you'll keep it, because it's the king's as much as Corwin's, and there aren't 10 men living who have it whole. Asheville, you've heard the name. A battle before I was born. A slaughter and barely a battle." Dunmore's eyes had gone somewhere far off. 30-odd years back, before Alaric was anything but a prince with a following and a claim. The old king, his uncle, was dying without a son, and there were 3 men who thought the throne might fall their way, and one of them decided it would fall faster if young Alaric fell first. They caught the prince's party in the Ashfell passes in the first snow, 100 men, most of them green, on a road with a cliff on one side and a river on the other and no way but through. It should have been the end of the house of Harrowgate. There'd be no King Alaric, no Prince Rowan, none of it. The line would have died in a snowbank in a pass nobody can find on a map anymore. But it didn't. It didn't because of 30 men who wouldn't run and one who wouldn't stop. Dunmore took the jug back. Alaric took a lance through the shoulder in the first rush and a horsefall on top of it, and by dark he was more dead than living, fevered out of his head, bleeding into the snow. His own guard captain, a man called Halloran, the finest soldier I ever knew, got him off the road and into the rocks, and then Halloran went back for the rest and didn't come out. And that left the prince, the whole future of the realm, in the dark and the snow and the cold, in the hands of a nobody, a foundling, a boy the muster rolls had taken in off the road at 14 because he was big and had nowhere else to be. No name of his own worth the ink. They'd written him down under the name of the parish that found him, because he had no other. I understood slowly whom he meant. Hale. Corwin Hale, said Dunmore, who was 18 years old that winter, and carried a dying prince 3 nights and 2 days through the Ashfell passes with a hunting party and God knows what else on his trail, and would not put him down. Would not stop. The prince begging him to leave him and save himself out of his head, mind, not knowing what he said, and the boy carrying him and answering him and carrying him. 3 nights. When they came down out of the passes to the loyal country on the far side, there were 9 of the 100 left alive, and one of them was the prince, because a nameless boy would not set him down. The corridor above us was quiet. Somewhere a clock told the half-hour. After, Dunmore said, when Alaric was king, he could have made Corwin anything. A lord, a general, land, a name, a house. Corwin had earned all of it twice over, and Corwin wouldn't have a scrap of it. Wanted to be a guardsman, just that. To stand at the king's door and hold it. The king begged him, begged, I'm told, which kings don't do, to take a title at least, and Corwin said the only thing he wanted was to be trusted to stand where it mattered. And Alaric, who's no fool, understood that he'd just been offered the rarest thing a king can be offered, which is a man who wants nothing from him but to be allowed to guard him. So he let him. Sergeant of the household guard, and never a step higher, by Corwin's own choosing, for 30 years. I found my voice. Then whatever he's guarding now is the king, said Dunmore. One way or another, whatever's behind that door, Corwin's guarding the king, because that's the only thing Corwin Hale has ever done or ever wanted to do. And if he won't move, then somewhere in this I'd stake my life the king himself set him there and told him how it ends. Not the queen, not a seal. The king, mouth to ear, the way those two have settled everything that ever mattered between them for 30 years. He stood, joints cracking. That's what I know. Now here's what I don't, and it's the thing that frightens me. Whatever word the king gave him to end it by, Corwin's waiting on it. You can see he's waiting. The king's the only one who can speak it. And the king's behind that door too, sick to speak. So unless the king wakes and finds a way to send that word out to him, he did not finish. He did not have to. I sat on the stair a long time after he had gone, holding a jug I never drank from, and I understood the trap in its full and terrible shape. Hale was waiting for a word only the king could give. The king was dying behind the very door Hale would not leave. If the king never woke, Hale would stand there until they broke him, and be written down a mutineer, and the word would never come because the only mouth that held it lay silent 8 feet behind his back. And Morwenna did not need the king to wake. She needed only for him to stay silent 3 more days, until the court ruled and Hale was dragged away, and the door swung open, and she reached the sickbed first, ahead of a crown prince still fighting the wind at sea. Time was on her side. Time is always on the side of the one who wants nothing to change until it is too late to change it. The 6th day showed me how right my fear had been, and how much worse than I had imagined. I learned it in pieces, the way a guardsman learns everything, a word from a clerk, a thing overheard, the shape of who came and went. By the 6th day the queen consort had summoned the Regency Council. It is an old body and rarely called. The great officers of the realm, the senior lords, the keepers of the seals, who by ancient custom may, when a king cannot rule and the heir is absent or unfit, name a regent to hold the crown's power until the king recovers or the heir comes of age or comes home. It exists for exactly this: a throne with a living king who cannot speak and an heir a fortnight's sail away. And Morwenna, as consort, had the right to summon it, and it would sit in 3 days' time. The same 3 days' reign had bought Hale. The Court of Inquiry and the Regency Council would sit, as near as made no difference, on the same morning. The arithmetic of it was so clean it turned my stomach. On that morning the court would rule Hale a mutineer and have him taken from the door. On that same morning the council would meet to name a regent, and the only candidate in the house, with the heir at sea and the king silent, was the woman who had summoned them. And the very first act of a regent, the very first, would be to walk down the rose corridor to a door no longer guarded and enter the king's apartments and be, at last and lawfully and alone but for her own people, mistress of everything the king could no longer defend. His seal, his papers, his person, the whole realm resting on a sickbed in the hands of the one who wanted it. Unless, of course, there was a paper already. A paper the king had made against exactly this, a testament, a settlement of the regency in his own true hand, naming who should hold his power if he fell. A paper that, if it existed, would sit in the one place a king keeps the thing that matters most. Behind the rose door. I did not know that 6th day whether such a paper existed, but I saw, suddenly and completely, why a man might be told to hold a door with his life until the king himself said otherwise, not to keep a wife from her husband's bedside, to keep the wrong hand off the one document that stood between an ambitious woman and a stolen crown, in the days before the rightful heir could reach home. The door was not the thing. What lay behind it was the thing, and a seal on a paper, even the king's true seal, pressed while he lay senseless, by a matrix that never left the apartments and could be reached by anyone who reached the room. A seal could be made to say anything at all. The king had known it, somewhere in the first minutes after he fell or in some quiet hour long before, foreseeing the shape of his own weakness. He had done the one thing that could not be forged. He had given a living man a living order, sealed with no wax but a spoken word, and set him at the door. Not the seal, the sergeant, because a seal obeys whoever holds the matrix, and a man obeys only what he swore to. I wanted that night to run to Rain and pour all of it out, Dunmore's story, my fear, the arithmetic of the 2 courts. But I was a boy of 24 days, and what did I truly have? A tale of a battle before my birth, a guess about a paper I had never seen, a conviction and no proof at all. Rain already knew Hale better than I ever would. If the commander needed a boy to tell him what was behind the rose door, then we were all already lost. So I did the only thing my station allowed. I kept my post near the corridor, and I watched, and I waited, as Hale waited, for a word that only a dying man could give. That was the plan I made for myself, and the house unmade it that same night, because it turned out I was not to be allowed to only watch. Dunmore had warned me. I had not believed a boy of my rank could matter enough to be leaned on. I was wrong, and the leaning, when it came, was gentler and more frightening than any shouting in the corridor had been. I was summoned, an hour past the evening meal, to a small anteroom off the guard hall, and I went with my heart in my mouth, certain I had done something wrong. Captain Sarn was there, and one of Penhallow's clerks with a wax tablet, and a jug of the good wine that never came near a guardsman of 24 days. Sarn was all warmth. That was the first thing that frightened me. I had watched the man go purple screaming at Hale, and here he was pouring me wine and calling me by my name as though we were old comrades. "Frey, sit. You've had a hard few days standing that corridor. Sharp-eyed lad, they tell me. You've been near the rose door more than most." He let that sit. "You'll have seen things." "I've stood my post, sir." "Of course you have," he smiled. "Here's the thing, Frey. There's a court of inquiry coming, and courts want witnesses, steady young men who saw what they saw and can say it plainly. It would go well for such a young man. Commanders remember a witness who helped the house put a hard matter to rest. There's a corporal's stripe not far off for a lad who's noticed and helps." He turned his cup. "You've seen the sergeant refuse lawful orders. You've seen him refuse the chamberlain, refuse the Queen's own hand under the King's seal. You'd only need to say what you saw, the truth. Nothing more." And there it was laid out so reasonably that for one shameful moment it did sound like nothing more than the truth. I had seen Hale refuse those orders. I had seen it with my own eyes. Every word they wanted me to say was a fact. That is the trick of it, and I want to set it down plainly for anyone who has never had a great house lean its whole weight on them with a smile. They do not ask you to lie. They ask you to say true things in an order that builds a lie, and to leave out the one true thing, that a man refusing orders is not the same as a man betraying them, because that one thing is the only one that cannot be written on a clerk's tablet. I thought of Dunmore on the stair. The loudest man in the corridor is almost never the one who's right. And I thought of the swaying red figure at the door, holding a thing too heavy to carry, alone. "Sir," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, "I did see the sergeant refuse those orders, and if the court asks me I'll say so because it's true." Sarn's smile warmed further. "And if the court asks me what I made of it, I'll say that too. I'll say I watched a captain, a chamberlain, a magistrate, and a queen fail to move that man, and that not one of them was afraid he'd run, every one of them was afraid he wouldn't. I'll say a man who's cracked runs or rages or weeps, and that sergeant did none of it. He stood, and he grieved to stand, and he apologized to the corporal sent to relieve him. I'll say I don't know what he's keeping. But I'll say I'd sooner trust the man who's sorry to refuse than the men who are so eager to make him." The clerk had stopped writing. Sarn's smile did not survive the middle of it. "You're a fool, boy," he said, and the warmth was gone as though a lamp had been shuttered. "You've a career in front of you and you're throwing it under a mutineer's boots. When the court writes him down, and it will, you'll go down as the boy who spoke for him. Think on that tonight." "I have thought on it, sir." I stood, because I did not trust my legs to keep still if I stayed sitting under his eyes. "May I return to my post?" He waved me out in disgust, and I went back up to the cold corridor with my knees shaking and something in my chest I had not had going in, a strange, fierce steadiness, the first I had ever earned. I had done more than watch. It had cost me a corporal's stripe and made me an enemy of an ambitious captain, and I would not have traded it for the whole treasury under the floor. Hale had never spoken a word to me in 7 days. He did not know my name. And I had, in that little wine-warmed room, taken my place beside him anyway, because once you have truly seen a man keep faith at that price, you cannot afterward sell yours cheap and go on thinking well of yourself. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the near window of the Rose corridor, off duty and unbidden, and kept a kind of vigil of my own, a boy's small echo of the sergeant's great one. And I was there, still awake, when the 7th day broke. On the morning of the 7th day the word came, or seemed to. And it was not the word Hale was waiting for. It was worse, and it was cleverer, and it very nearly finished everything. She had learned the shape of the lock. That was what I understood, watching it happen, and it chilled me more than anything before it. Somewhere in 7 days of clerks and listeners and a chamberlain who missed nothing, Morwenna had come to understand what Hale was: not a broken man, not a madman, but a lock waiting for a key that was a word. And if a lock waits for a word, then a clever enough hand does not break the lock. It guesses the word. They came in a small grave procession that morning, and they had dressed it beautifully. The Lord Chamberlain with his clerks, one of the magistrates, and walking between them with his eyes lowered and his hands folded, the king's own under-physician, a soft, frightened young man named Corwin, who assisted the senior physician and who had not, I would learn, set foot inside the Rose apartment since the first night, because Dr. Wren had barred it. But the coroner did not know that. The coroner saw a physician of the king's household come from the direction of the sick room with news. Penhallow spoke, and he spoke gently, and every word was a knife wrapped in wool. "Sergeant Hale, the king woke in the night." A stir ran the corridor. Briefly, Dr. Corwin was present. His Majesty was lucid for a few moments, and he spoke, and among what he said, "Sergeant, he gave an instruction meant for you, for the man at his door. Dr. Corwin will tell you what the king said in the king's own words, and then you will know that the king himself has released you, and you may rest, and let his wife come to him at last." It was perfect. I saw the perfection of it and felt sick. If Hale was waiting for the king's word, they would give him the king's word from the mouth of a physician too frightened to have invented it before witnesses with the ring of truth. And Hale had no way to know it was false. He had not been in the room. He could not know his king had never woken. All he could do was take a young physician's trembling word for it, or call a physician of the household a liar to his face in the king's own corridor, which no sergeant could do and survive. Corwin lifted his eyes. He was sweating. "Sergeant," he said, and his voice shook, and he spoke the words they had given him to speak. "I have no doubt now they were given him, and that some part of him knew it and hated it. The king said," he said, "tell my man at the door his watch is done. Tell him the Rose is safe. He may stand aside now, and God keep him." The Rose is safe. It was well guessed. It was more than well guessed. It was nearly the truth, a phrase built out of everything a listener at that door might have inferred. The rose of the house, the roses on the very door, the sense of a thing kept safe. If I had been Hale, exhausted past the edge of the world, 7 days without proper sleep, longing past bearing to be released, I think it might have broken me. I think I might have wanted so badly for it to be the word that I would have let it be the word. Hale looked at the young physician for a long moment, and then he did the gentlest cruel thing I ever saw a man do. He said, very quietly, so quietly that only the front of the procession heard it, and I caught it only because the corridor was holding its breath. "Doctor, look at me, not at the chamberlain." "At me?" And Corwin, helpless, looked at him. "Did the king say that? With his own mouth to your own ear and no man's hand on your shoulder, on your soul, doctor, did he?" Corwin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His eyes filled. And in the silence where his answer should have been, the lie died because a frightened decent boy could not hold it under the weight of an old man's plain question. He did not confess. He did not have the courage for that, and I do not entirely blame him. But he could not say yes, and his not saying yes was louder than any confession, and everyone in that corridor heard it. "It is not the word," said Hale, and turned his eyes back to the middle distance. "I am sorry, doctor. Go and be sick somewhere. It's a hard thing they've made you carry." The procession dissolved in a small, ugly flurry, Penhallow already turning away, the magistrate already reaching for his notes to make the failure into something else. But the thing had been shown, in front of all of us, and it could not be unshown. There was a word, a true word. Hale was holding the door against a false one and waiting on a true one, and the true one had a shape so exact that a lucky guest dressed in a king's authority had not fit it. The Rose is safe was close enough to fool a whole corridor. It was not close enough to fool the man it was for, which meant the true word was not a phrase anyone could reason their way to. It was a thing between two men and no others. A thing you either had from the king's own mouth, or did not have at all. I understood then why the king had chosen it, and I understood with a fresh cold weight that we were no closer to it. The guess had failed, but the arithmetic of the two courts had not changed, and there were 2 days left. That night the false dawn came, and it very nearly saved us, and then it did not. It began with a boy running, a signal boy up from the river gate, breathless on the servant's stair, and the word he carried went through the lower house like fire. A cutter had been sighted below the great bend. Prince Rowan's cutter. The heir was in the river. He would make the palace landing by morning. The wind that had carried him away had turned at last and was carrying him home, and if he came before the court sat, then everything changed. The Regency Council could not name a regent with the heir standing in the room. The whole clean machine of Morwenna's arithmetic came apart the moment Rowan set his boot on the landing. I remember gripping Dunmore's arm hard enough to bruise it. I remember thinking, he'll be here. Hold one more night, Sergeant, and he'll be here, and it's over. Hale did not know. I longed to run and tell him, the boy is coming, hold, only hold, but a boy of 25 days does not shout news up the king's own corridor. And in truth I think he knew already. The way he seemed to know everything from his station without moving. I think he heard it in the pitch of the house the way a sailor hears weather. He stood at the door as he had stood for 7 days, and if hope reached him he did not show it, because hope was not the word, and only the word would move him. And then, near midnight, the wind that had turned again. I heard it before I understood it, the change in the sound of the courtyard, the flags gone loud, the first hard spatter of rain across the tall windows. A river squall, sudden and mean, the kind that boils up out of a spring night and turns a night landing into a drowning. By the small hours the word came back up the stair, and it was the opposite of hope. The cutter had been forced to stand off below the bend, unable to make the landing in the dark, and the wind, anchored in the Black River a mile short of home. Rowan was so close we could nearly have signaled him with a lamp, and he could not come, not in the dark. Not until the wind dropped or the light came, and the Regency Council was called for the 9th hour of the morning, and the Court of Inquiry for the 8th. I did the sum in the dark on the servant's stair with the rain on the windows, and it came out the way Morwenna had built it to come out. At the 8th hour they would take Hale from the door. At the 9th they would name a regent, and Rowan, the one man whose arrival unmade all of it, would step onto the landing somewhere near the 10th or the 11th, an hour too late, into a house already lost, to find his father's door standing open and a regent already installed, and a sergeant already dragged away in chains for having tried, alone, to hold the last hour against the flood. An hour, it came down to an hour, it so often does. I went up to the corridor in the last of the dark because I could not stay away, and I stood at my nothing post at the near window with the rain running down the glass, and I watched Sergeant Corwin Hale stand at the rose door in the gray before the worst morning of his life, and I saw, at last, the cost of it whole. 7 nights. He was swaying, a slow, minute sway, caught and corrected, the sway of a man holding himself upright by will alone across the last gap before the body simply stops. His face had gone to bone and shadow. His gloved hands on the muzzle cap were not quite steady. He had eaten almost nothing and slept not at all, and in 3 hours the whole armed weight of the house would come down that corridor with the law on its side to take him, and he had no word and no rescue, and no hope that anyone could see, and he stood. He stood, not because he thought he would win. I am certain now that by that gray hour Hale no longer thought he would win. He stood because the king had told him to stand, and the king had not yet told him to stop, and for Corwin Hale that was the beginning and the end of the matter, world without end. There is a kind of faith that survives the death of hope, and I saw it that morning in a swaying old man at a carved door, and I have measured every loyalty I have met since against it, and found most of them wanting. Then, in the last gray minutes before the house woke to undo him, the rose door opened from the inside a hand's width, no more, and a voice spoke through the gap, and everything began at last to turn. The voice belonged to Dr. Wren. I had heard the name and never the man. He was the king's senior physician, and he had been on the far side of that door for 7 days and 7 nights, sealed in with his patient by the same charge that had sealed Hale outside it. For the king's order had been to both of them, I would learn. The guard to let no one in, the physician to leave no one but himself to tend the king, so that no hand but a trusted one came near the sickbed in the days of the king's weakness. Wren had food and water enough in the apartments to last a siege. Kings keep their innermost rooms provisioned against exactly the sort of night the realm was having. He had spent a week in a shuttered chamber, fighting for the life of the man the whole house was quarreling over, and no one on our side of the door had known whether he or his patient still lived. Now his voice came through the gap, cracked and urgent and joyful all at once. "Corwin, Corwin, he's awake. He's been awake since the turn of the night, and he's in his right mind, thank God. He's weak as water, but he's himself. I've told him. All of it, 7 days, the courts, the council at the 9th hour, what they mean to do to you. He wants the commander. Now, before the house wakes. Get me rain." I did not wait to be told. I was down the near stair and running before I had decided to run, a boy of 25 days pelting through the sleeping galleries of the palace to hammer on the door of the commander of the household guard, and I have never in my life been so glad to disobey the whole idea of my station. Rain came to the corridor within minutes, half-dressed, his sword belt in his hand, his still face for once not still at all. He went to the gap in the rose door, and he knelt, the commander of the guard, on one knee on the marble, to put his ear to a hand's width of open door. And for a long while there was only the low murmur of a voice inside, a voice gone thin and rough with illness, but unmistakably, a voice that expected to be obeyed. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. I watched Rain's face as he received them, and I watched the last shadow of doubt go out of it and something else come into it, something that in a lesser man I would have called awe. Then the king's voice rose, just for a moment, just enough that those of us in the corridor caught the shape of it, and it said, "And you will do it where they can see, Torvald, every one of them. I will not have it done in a corner. He kept faith in front of the whole house. He will be released in front of the whole house." Rain bowed his head to the gap. "Yes, Majesty." "And Torvald," the voice softened and roughened further, and I have never forgotten it. "The words I have given you, when you say them to him, say them plain. He has waited a long time to hear them, longer than 7 days." "Yes, Majesty." The door drew shut. Rain rose from his knee. He turned and he looked down the corridor at all of us, at me, at the guardsmen gathering as the house began to stir, at the gray window and the ending rain, and he said in the flat carrying voice of command, "Wake the house. Rouse the court and the council and the chamberlain and the magistrates and her majesty, and bring them here to this corridor before this door, every one of them. If they mean to sit in judgment at the 8th hour, they can do it here, at the place they've been so eager to reach." A grim light came into his eyes. "Tell them the sergeant's post is to be settled in full view. Tell them Her Majesty will not want to miss it." She did not miss it. None of them did. Within the half-hour, the Rose Corridor held the whole machinery that had been built to break one man, Penhallow with his chain and his clerks, the 2 magistrates with their papers, Captain Sarn with a file of guardsmen at his back ready to do the taking, the great officers gathering in confusion at being summoned before dawn to a corridor instead of a council chamber, and coming last and unhurried in her gray, the queen consort Morwenna, who had built the morning and did not yet know it had been rebuilt around her. She saw Rain standing beside Hale, beside him, not before him, and I watched her read it, watched the first flicker of something wary cross that composed face. But she had come too far to stop, and the arithmetic was still hers, and the king, as far as she knew, still lay silent behind the door. "Commander," she said, "this is irregular. The court sits at the 8th hour. Until then." "Until then, madam, this is a guard matter, and I am settling it." Rain did not raise his voice. He turned to Hale. And I saw, close now, what 7 days had done. Hale swayed on his feet. His eyes were sunk and fever-bright with exhaustion, and I do not think he fully understood in that moment that rescue had come. I think he had gone so far into the country beyond hope that he stood braced for the hands and the chains, and was simply waiting to see whether he could keep his feet while they took him. He looked at his commander the way, A man looks at something a great way off. Rain stepped close to him, and the commander of the household guard, before the assembled court of the realm, before the queen consort and the chamberlain and the magistrates, and the file of guardsmen sent to drag him away, before a boy of 25 days who has never since seen anything to match it, the commander spoke to Sergeant Corwin Hale just 2 words. "Still here?" I did not understand them. Almost no one in that corridor understood them. To the court it must have sounded like nothing, 2 small, ordinary words, a fragment, the beginning of a sentence that never came. Penhallow's brow creased. Morwenna's eyes went sharp with the effort of finding the threat in words that carried none. 2 words. That was all. "Still here." But I was watching Hale's face, and so I saw the thing the words were made for. He broke, not into weakness, into release. 30 years of a held breath went out of Corwin Hale in a single moment. His eyes filled and overran, and he did not lift a hand to it. His mouth worked, and out of it, in a voice I had not heard from him in 7 days, a voice worn down to the boy who had once carried a dying prince through the snow and answered him all through the dark, so the prince would know he had not been left. Out of that voice came the countersign, the answer, the other half of the oldest exchange between his king and himself, given back now for the last time. "Still here," said Sergeant Hale. And he stood aside from the rose door. He grounded his rifle and took 1 step to his left, 1 step, the smallest movement, and the most enormous I have ever witnessed. And the door he had held for 7 days and 7 nights against captains and chamberlains and magistrates and a queen and the whole reasonable weight of a great house stood, for the first time, unguarded. For a heartbeat no one moved. The taking party stood uncertain, their reason for existing gone. Morwenna took a half-step toward the open way, the instinct of 7 days' hunger carrying her forward before her mind could catch it. And the rose door swung wide from the inside, and Dr. Wren stepped out into the side and bowed low, and framed in the doorway of his own innermost apartments, gaunt and gray and swaddled in a bedrobe, and leaning hard on the arm of a chair that Wren had set for him to reach. Upright by the same iron will his sergeant had spent a week borrowing, stood King Alaric, alive and awake, and looking out at his court with eyes that had a great deal to say. The corridor went down like wheat before a scythe, the whole court sinking into bows and curtsies, the guardsmen to attention, the magistrates fumbling their papers. Only 3 people did not move. Rain at the salute. Hale, 1 step aside from the door, swaying, weeping without shame, and Morwenna caught in her half-step toward a room she would now never enter, her face emptying of everything it had worn for 7 days until there was nothing left on it but the truth. The king's first words were for his sergeant. Of course they were. "Corwin." The voice was a ruin of itself, but it filled the corridor because everyone had stopped breathing to hear it. 7 days. I told you it might be 1 night. I am sorry. I could not send the word sooner. I could not send it at all until this hour. His eyes moved, slow and heavy, to the guardsmen with their empty chains. "You came to take my sergeant away." No one answered a king that question. "Let me tell you what my sergeant was doing," said Alaric, "so that it is said in front of all of you and written down and never mistaken again." He drew a breath that cost him. "When I fell, I had a few minutes of my wits before the dark took me. I have lived long enough to know what a king's weakness draws out of the people around him, as a wound draws flies. I knew that while I lay senseless, a seal would be pressed, and papers would be made, and my power would be spent by a hand that was not mine, and that my son was a fortnight at sea and could not stop it. So in those few minutes I did the one thing that a seal cannot be made to do, and a forged paper cannot undo. I gave a living man a spoken charge. I told Corwin Hale to hold that door and admit no one and obey no order, not the chamberlain, not the council, not a paper under my own seal, not the queen, not his own commander. Until he heard from a mouth he trusted 2 words that I and 1 other man alive have ever exchanged. I built a lock that no wax could open. And then I trusted it to the only man I have ever known who could not be moved, could not be fooled, and could not be bought, because 30 years ago he proved it to me in a snowbank with my life on his back. He looked at the assembled great officers, and there was iron in the ruin of his voice. He refused a captain because I told him to. He refused my chamberlain because I told him to. He refused a paper under my own true seal pressed, I have no doubt, by a hand that reached my matrix while I could not guard it, because I told him that my seal is wax, and my word is not, and in the days of my weakness he was to trust only my word. He refused my commander, whom he would follow into fire, because I made him swear to refuse even him. And he refused. The king's eyes found Morwenna and rested there, a wife at her husband's door, which is the cruelest order I ever gave a good man, and which I gave precisely because I knew it would be the hardest to hold, and because I knew what she meant to do when she reached this room. "Husband," Morwenna began. "There is a paper on the table behind me," said the king, not to her, but to the court, to the record, to the mourning. "In my own hand, written and witnessed a year ago and kept in this room, which names the ordering of the realm if I should fall and my son be absent. The crown's power to be held by my sister, the Princess Adela, in trust for Prince Rowan until he comes of his own to it. That is my settled will, and it has lain behind that door the whole 7 days, whole and unaltered, because a sergeant would not let it be reached." His gaze came back to Morwenna, and it was very tired and very final. "There is another paper, madam, which the council was to be shown at the 9th hour. I have not read it. I think we all know whose name it raises and whose seal it bears, and that the seal is mine and the hand that pressed it was not. Give it to the commander." She did not give it to the commander. She stood a moment longer, and then whatever had held her upright for 7 days went out of her all at once, and she turned, without a word, and walked back up the rose corridor through a court that drew aside from her as she came, not roughly, not with jeers, only with the terrible quiet of people stepping back from something they have finally seen whole. Rain sent 2 guardsmen after her, unhurried. The Princess Adela, sent for at the first light, would sit that same day to weigh the forged decree and the hand behind it, and would be, by every account, exactly as just and exactly as merciless as the law required and no more, but that is another morning story, and it belongs to her, not to me. Prince Rowan made the landing with the turning of the tide, 2 hours after the door opened, and came up through the water gate still in his sea cloak, to find his father alive against every rumor that had reached him down the river, and the 2 of them behind the rose door a long while with no one else admitted. No one, that is, but the sergeant who had kept it, for the king would not have the door shut on Corwin Hale ever again. They tried to reward him. Of course they did. The king, restored week by week through that spring, offered him again everything he had offered 30 years before and been refused: a title, land, a captaincy, a name to hang above a door of his own. And Sergeant Hale, who by then had slept and eaten and become once more the still red figure I had first mistaken for a broken man, refused all of it once more, with the same request he had made as a young man, only to be trusted to stand where it mattered. The king, I am told, did not beg this time. He had learned. He only clasped the old sergeant's arm and said something that no one was near enough to hear, and let him go back to his post. I know now what the 2 words meant. Dunmore told me the last of it, and Hale himself, years later, told me the rest, on a night when he was in a rare telling mood, and I had earned, by then, the right to ask. Through the 3 nights of the Asheville passes, the fevered prince had been sure he was being left to die in the snow, and again through the dark he had asked the boy carrying him the same question, the only question that mattered to a man who believed he had been abandoned by the whole world. "Are you still there?" And again, all through 3 nights, the nameless boy had answered him, "Still here, still here." It was the whole of what he had to give, not skill, not rescue, only presence, only the refusal to be gone, and it was enough, because it was true. And when they came down out of the passes into the daylight and the loyal country, And the prince understood at last that he was going to live, that he had not been left. He had turned his head on the boy's shoulder and set it back to him, the only thanks large enough still here, and made of 2 small words a bond that no wax and no seal and no 30 years could wear thin. That was the lock the king built against the worst hour of his reign. Not a cipher a clever mind could crack, not a phrase a listener could guess. 2 ordinary words that meant nothing to anyone in the world but 2 men, and everything to them, the promise of a boy who would not leave, given back by the king he had carried, and kept both of them to the end. I have served a long time since. I have stood many posts and taken many orders and learned, mostly, when to obey them. But I measure them all still against the 7th gray morning and the swaying old man at the carved door who would not be moved by a captain or a chamberlain or a queen or the whole reasonable weight of a great house, because the one voice he was waiting for had not yet spoken, and who, when at last it did, wept and answered and stepped aside, having ignored every order in the realm to keep the only one that ever bound him. Still here, it is, I have come to think, the whole of what any of us are asked in the end, and the hardest thing in the world to be. Corwin Hale was asked it, and for 7 days and 7 nights and 30 years before them he was.